It was a quiet winter evening in a small town in Ohio. Jake Miller, a 22-year-old grocery clerk, rushed into the local pharmacy, his hands shaking as he placed a few crumpled bills and coins on the counter. His mother's heart medicine cost more than he had. He was short by $18. The pharmacist gave him a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, Jake. Without the full amount, I can't release the medicine." Jake forced a weak smile, nodding as tears welled up in his eyes. He stepped outside into the cold, defeated, unaware that a stranger had just witnessed everything. The icy wind swept through the quiet streets of Maplewood, a small Ohio town that seemed frozen in time. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and gray in the winter sky. Jake Miller trudged down Main Street, his shoulders hunched, his hands stuffed deep inside his worn jacket pockets. The sound of his boots crunching on the snow was the only thing breaking the silence. In his pocket was a small paper slip, the pharmacy receipt showing how close he had come to saving his mother's life. $18 short. That was all. $18 stood between his mother's fragile heart and another night of pain. Inside the pharmacy, a man had seen everything. David Anderson, mid-30s, calm face, the kind of man who blended into a crowd, stood near the back counter holding a small bottle of cough syrup. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Jake's trembling voice carried through the quiet store. I'm short," Jake had said, his voice cracking. "Can I just take half the medicine, please? My mom, she needs it tonight." The pharmacist, a kind but helpless woman in her 50s, had shaken her head. "I'm sorry, Jake, I wish I could, but store policy—" Jake had nodded quickly, blinking away tears. "I understand. It's not your fault." Then he'd counted his coins again, slowly, as if praying a miracle might appear between his fingers. But it hadn't. When he realized he couldn't afford it, he'd mumbled a thank you and walked out into the cold night, shoulders slumped, spirit broken. David had watched every second of it. Now, standing by the counter, he felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know this kid, but something about the look in Jake's eyes had stirred something old in his chest. A memory. Years ago, David's own father had been the one standing at a pharmacy counter, short on cash for David's asthma medicine. David still remembered the shame on his father's face, and the stranger who had stepped forward to help without a word. That act had changed everything for them, and now fate had brought him here, in this quiet pharmacy, watching a young man carry the same burden. David approached the counter, voice soft but certain. "Excuse me, ma'am. The boy who was just here, how much was he short?" The pharmacist looked up, startled. "You mean Jake? About $18, poor kid. He works 2 jobs, and his mom's really sick." David nodded, pulling out his wallet. "Please, put it on my bill." Her eyebrows rose. "You sure you want to do that?" "He didn't ask. He doesn't have to," David interrupted gently. "Just tell him someone wanted to help." The pharmacist's eyes softened. "You want me to give him the medicine if he comes back?" "Yes," David said, slipping a couple of 20s across the counter. "And keep the change, for the next person who might need it." The pharmacist smiled faintly. "The world could use more people like you." David shook his head. "I'm just repaying what was given to me once." As he left the pharmacy, the bell above the door jingled softly, and a gust of cold air swept in. Across the street, the lamplights flickered against the snow. 5 minutes later, Jake reappeared, his breath visible in the freezing air, eyes red from crying. He stepped cautiously inside, rubbing his numb hands together. "Ma'am, I was wondering if maybe I could leave my ID here and pay the rest tomorrow. Please, my mom needs her medicine tonight." The pharmacist gave him a gentle smile. "Jake, you don't have to. Someone already covered the rest." Jake blinked. What? Who did?" "They didn't want me to say," she replied softly. "They just wanted to help." Jake froze. For a moment, he couldn't move or speak. He just stood there, staring at the little white bag the pharmacist slid across the counter. He reached out slowly, as if afraid it might disappear. "Thank you," he whispered, not just to her, but to the unseen stranger who had just lifted the weight off his shoulders. The pharmacist smiled kindly. "Take care of your mom, Jake." He nodded quickly, clutching the bag to his chest. "I will. I promise." As he stepped outside, the cold air hit his face. But it didn't sting this time. Something inside him felt warm again. Hope. He looked up at the night sky, stars faintly visible through thin clouds. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Whoever you are, thank you. You saved her life tonight." Across the street, David watched quietly from beneath the glowing lamppost, his breath fogging in the air. He saw Jake walking away, medicine in hand, and for the first time in a long while, David smiled. It was a small smile, humble, content, the kind that came from doing something good without needing to be seen. He turned and began walking down the snow-covered sidewalk, his boots crunching softly. Behind him, the pharmacy's neon sign flickered. Open 24 hours, a tiny beacon of hope in a tired world. That night, the Miller house was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock and the faint hum of a space heater. Jake sat beside his mother's bed, the light from a small lamp casting a soft glow over the room. Mrs. Miller looked frail, her gray hair tied in a loose bun, her breathing uneven. But when Jake placed the medicine bottle on the nightstand, her eyes filled with relief. "Oh, Jake," she whispered weakly. "You got it?" Jake nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Mom, someone helped us." "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. He hesitated. "I don't know." "The pharmacist said they wanted to stay anonymous." Mrs. Miller smiled faintly. "There are still angels in this world, sweetheart." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah, I guess there are." He helped her sit up and gave her the medicine with a glass of water. Then he sat beside her as she rested, her breathing steadier now. The warmth of the small room couldn't hide the cracks in the walls or the thinness of the blankets, but it didn't matter. Tonight, there was peace. Jake looked at his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, and whispered, "I promise, Mom. One day I'll be the one helping others like he helped us." She smiled weakly. "You already have the heart for it, Jake. Never lose that." As she drifted to sleep, Jake stared at the small bottle of pills on the table. Each pill represented more than medicine. It was a reminder that goodness still existed, even in strangers. Across town, David Anderson sat alone in his small apartment above a diner. The room was simple. One table, one chair, a small window overlooking Main Street. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out at the snowflakes swirling under the streetlight. He thought about the boy, about the way his voice had trembled when he asked for help, the way he'd said thank you to no one in particular. David smiled again. He didn't need recognition. The quiet satisfaction was enough. But as he sipped his coffee, a thought crossed his mind. What if that kid needed more than just money? What if this was only the beginning of something deeper? A connection fate had designed for a reason. He didn't know it yet, but their paths would cross again, in a way neither of them could have imagined. For now, though two souls, one young, one older, slept under the same Ohio sky, bound by a single act of kindness that neither would ever forget. The gray Ohio sky hung low that morning, heavy with clouds that threatened snow. Main Street was half awake, shop lights flickering on, the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the corner diner. Inside that little diner, the kind where the same customers came every day and the walls were lined with old photos of baseball teams and faded menus, Jake Miller moved quickly from table to table, balancing plates and coffee pots. It had been 3 days since the night he couldn't afford his mother's medicine. 3 days since the mysterious stranger had stepped in and changed everything. He still thought about it constantly. Who was that person? Why would anyone help a complete stranger without even wanting to be known? Those thoughts stayed in his mind as he worked the breakfast shift. He needed the money more than ever now. Mrs. Miller's next round of medication would cost even more. The diner job didn't pay much, but it was honest work. "Jake!" called out Rita, the head waitress, a woman in her 50s with a raspy smoker's voice. "Table 5 needs their order." "Got it," Jake replied with a smile. He was tired, but his spirit never showed it. Even with the weight he carried, he treated everyone with warmth. At that same moment, the doorbell jingled. A man stepped inside, brushing the snow off his jacket. David Anderson. He looked around the diner, small booths, chatter, and the smell of bacon and pancakes filling the air. He had been driving through town after a meeting when something nudged him to stop here. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was fate. But when his eyes fell on the young waiter hurrying across the floor, something inside him froze. It was him, the same boy from the pharmacy, Jake Miller. David's expression softened. Jake looked different in the daylight. His eyes were brighter, his movements quick and graceful as he balanced a tray. But that same humility, that quiet dignity, was there. David took a seat at a booth by the window, pretending not to notice. Jake walked over a minute later holding a notepad. "Good morning, sir. What can I get you?" David smiled faintly. "Just coffee for now. Black." "Coming right up." Jake scribbled the order and left. As he waited, David watched him from across the diner, the way he smiled at an old couple, helped a kid pick up dropped napkins, and joked with the cook behind the counter. There was something admirable in the way Jake carried himself, humble, hard-working, and kind despite his struggles. When Jake returned with the coffee, he poured it carefully, avoiding spills. "Here you go, sir. Anything else?" David shook his head. "This is perfect, thanks." Jake nodded politely, about to leave, but David spoke again. "You seem like a good kid. Been working here long?" Jake smiled, tucking his notepad into his apron. "A few months. Just trying to make ends meet. My mom's sick, so I pick up extra shifts when I can." David nodded slowly, pretending this was the first he'd heard. "That's tough. Must be hard balancing all that." Jake shrugged lightly. "Yeah, but that's life, right? You can't stop moving just because things get hard." There was something in his tone, not bitterness, but resilience. A quiet strength that came from someone who'd seen enough pain to know how precious kindness was. David leaned back in his seat. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "not many people your age think like that. Most give up when things get rough." Jake smiled faintly, eyes focused on the coffee pot in his hand. "Maybe, but my mom always says kindness always comes back. You just have to keep doing good even when no one sees." David's heart tightened. The words hit deeper than he expected. He took a sip of his coffee, hiding the small smile that tugged at his lips. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman." "She is," Jake said proudly. "She's my hero. Even when she's sick, she worries more about me than herself. I just want to make her proud." For a brief moment, silence filled the booth. Not awkward, but thoughtful. The sound of clinking dishes and the soft hum of conversation surrounded them. David set down his coffee cup. "You know, Jake, I think you already are making her proud." Jake blinked, surprised. "You think so?" "I do," David said sincerely. "You're working hard, helping others, staying humble. That's more than most people ever do." Jake chuckled quietly. "Thanks, sir. I just wish it was enough sometimes." David tilted his head. "Enough?" "Enough to fix everything," Jake said softly. "Bills, hospital visits, groceries. Sometimes it feels like I'm always one paycheck away from breaking." He forced a small laugh. "But hey, no one ever said life was easy, right?" David studied him for a moment, the way his smile tried to hide the exhaustion behind it. He wanted to tell him right then that he was the one who had paid for the medicine, that he wasn't alone, but he stopped himself. It wasn't time yet. Some lessons of kindness were more powerful when left unseen. Instead, David smiled kindly. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Jake. Don't lose that heart of yours." Jake looked genuinely touched. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." The conversation paused when another customer called out and Jake excused himself to deliver a stack of pancakes. David watched him go, feeling an unfamiliar sense of pride. In just a few minutes he could tell. Jake wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something bigger. When Jake returned later with the check, David had already made up his mind. "How much do I owe you?" he asked casually. Jake glanced at the bill. "Just $3.45 for the coffee." David nodded and reached for his wallet. He placed a $20 bill on the table. Jake immediately shook his head. "Sir, that's way too much." "Keep it," David said with a warm smile. "Consider it. Appreciation for good service." Jake hesitated, then smiled awkwardly. "That's really kind of you." "Thank you." "Thank you," David replied, standing up, "for the reminder that there are still good people out there." Jake frowned slightly, not quite understanding, but he nodded anyway. "Have a great day, sir." David gave a polite wave and walked out, his boots crunching against the snow-covered sidewalk. As he stepped into the cold air, he looked up at the sky, the first flakes of snow beginning to fall. He thought about Jake's words again. Kindness always comes back. Maybe that's what this was. Life coming full circle. Back inside, Jake cleared the table and noticed something under the coffee cup, another folded bill. He opened it and stared in shock. A crisp $100 note. He looked out the diner window, eyes scanning the street, but David was already gone. Rita noticed his stunned expression. "Everything okay, kid?" Jake swallowed hard, still holding the bill. "Yeah, I think someone just paid me the nicest compliment of my life," Rita chuckled. "Some people got good hearts. Don't question it, just pass it on someday." Jake nodded slowly, smiling to himself. "Yeah, I will." That night, Jake walked home under the falling snow, the $100 bill tucked safely in his pocket. But it wasn't just about the money, it was the feeling. The reminder that there were still good people in the world. He reached home, where Mrs. Miller was sitting by the window, knitting quietly. "Long day?" she asked, smiling faintly. Jake nodded, sitting beside her. "Yeah, but something amazing happened today." "Oh?" she asked curiously. He grinned softly. "Someone left me a $100 tip at the diner. For just a cup of coffee." Mrs. Miller's eyes widened. "That's incredible, Jake, you see? The world always gives back when you keep faith." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, but I just wish I knew who these people were. First the medicine, now this. Feels like the universe is looking out for us." Mrs. Miller squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe it's not the universe, sweetheart. Maybe it's one person, someone who sees your heart." Jake thought for a moment, smiling at the idea. "Maybe, whoever they are, I hope they know how grateful I am." Meanwhile, across town, David sat in his car parked near a quiet park. The lights from the diner glowed faintly in his rearview mirror. He couldn't help but smile. He'd wanted to leave just a tip, but he couldn't resist doing a little more. Something about Jake's faith and determination reminded him of his younger self. He leaned back in the seat and whispered to himself, "You're doing good, kid. Keep going." The snow fell harder, blanketing the streets in white. Two souls, one struggling, one silently helping, were now connected not just by chance, but by purpose. And though Jake still didn't know the truth, fate was slowly weaving their lives closer together, for a reason that neither of them could yet see. The sun had barely set over the small town of Maplewood when the grocery store lights flickered on, casting long golden beams across the snow-covered parking lot. Inside, shelves were half empty, the aisles quiet except for the soft hum of refrigerators and the occasional beep of a checkout scanner. Jake Miller stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but alert. The name tag on his chest read, "Jake, Store Clerk." He'd just come from his diner shift, still smelling faintly of coffee and pancakes. His back ached, his hands were dry and cracked from the cold, but he smiled at every customer like it was his first shift of the day. Outside, a dark SUV pulled into the lot. David Anderson stepped out, tightening his jacket against the chill. He hadn't planned to come here. He was on his way home from the hospital, a follow-up on a community donation project he'd funded, when he saw the grocery store lights still on. Something, maybe instinct, maybe fate, told him to stop. When he stepped through the glass doors, the small bell above jingled. Jake looked up instantly. "Evening. We're open for another 20 minutes if you need anything." David smiled faintly. "Thanks. Just grabbing a few things." He took a basket, moving slowly down the aisles. From the corner of his eye, he watched Jake helping a young mother find baby formula, then restocking a shelf between customers. Every movement spoke of discipline, care, and quiet determination. When David reached the checkout counter a few minutes later, he found Jake outside, helping an elderly woman carry her grocery bags to her car. The woman protested softly. "Oh, honey, you don't have to do that." "I can manage." Jake shook his head with a grin. "It's no trouble, Mrs. Parker. The ice is slippery. I'd hate for you to fall." He carried her bags, loaded them carefully into the trunk, and even brushed snow off her car windows before waving goodbye. As he walked back toward the store, David found himself frozen in place. Watching, he'd seen good people before, generous, kind, selfless. But something about Jake's quiet humility hit him deeply. He wasn't doing it for attention. He wasn't performing goodness. He was simply good. When Jake returned, he noticed David waiting with his basket. "Sorry about that, sir. Just helping Mrs. Parker with her things." "No need to apologize," David said sincerely. "That was kind of you." Jake shrugged modestly. "She lives alone. Lost her husband last year. I try to help when I can." David placed his basket on the counter. "You always this helpful?" Jake chuckled. "Only when I'm not dead tired." David smiled. "Long day?" "Double shift," Jake admitted, scanning the items. "Diner from 6 to 3, grocery store from 4 to 10. Trying to save up for Mom's next appointment." David's chest tightened. That's a lot of work." Jake nodded, sliding a carton across the scanner. "Yeah, but I'm used to it. She's all I've got." He handed David his change with a faint smile. "Gotta take care of the people who took care of you, right?" David stared at him for a moment, unable to speak. The boy's words echoed something his own father had said to him decades ago. As David walked out of the store, groceries in hand, he paused by the door, glancing back at Jake. Still standing under the fluorescent lights, still smiling at the next customer, a strange ache filled his chest. Later that week, David found himself back at the local hospital. He was meeting with Dr. Laura Hayes, an old friend and the town's chief physician. They sat in her office, sipping coffee as snow fell softly against the window. "So," she said with a knowing smirk, "you're suddenly interested in community medical cases?" "That's not like you, David," David chuckled. "You make it sound suspicious." "It is suspicious," she teased. "You usually donate through your foundation anonymously. What's changed?" He hesitated for a long moment before answering. "There's this young man in town, Jake Miller." "You know him?" Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "I do. Comes here every few weeks for his mother's prescriptions. Sweet kid. Works himself half to death." She frowned slightly. "Why do you ask?" David looked down at his coffee cup, fingers tracing the rim. "Because I've been watching him. Not in a weird way. I just noticed him." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Noticed him?" "He reminds me of me," David said softly. "When I was his age, I was broke. My mother was sick too, heart disease. We could barely afford food, much less her medicine. And one day, someone helped us." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "I never even found out who it was. They paid our bill at the pharmacy, just like that. Saved my mom's life." Dr. Hayes leaned forward, her tone softening. "You never told me that." David smiled faintly. "It's not something I talk about, but it changed me. It made me want to help others when I could. And now, seeing Jake, it feels like life's come full circle." Dr. Hayes watched him carefully. "You mean to tell me you're the one who helped him last week?" David looked up, surprised. "You knew about that?" She nodded with a small smile. "Small town, remember? Word gets around. The pharmacist told me. Said some man paid the rest of the boy's bill and didn't leave a name. I figured it might be you." David sighed. "Yeah, that was me. I didn't want him to know." Dr. Hayes smiled knowingly. "You've got a good heart, David." He shook his head. "I don't know about that. I just can't stop thinking about him. The kid works double shifts, helps strangers, volunteers at the shelter on weekends. Did you know that?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "I did. He's been volunteering at the St. Mark's shelter for almost 2 years now. He doesn't talk much about it, but he's one of their best volunteers. Always the first to arrive, the last to leave." David's eyes widened slightly. "He volunteers after working 2 jobs?" Yeah, Laura said softly. I asked him once why he does it. He said, because I know what it's like to need help and not get any. The words hit David like a quiet punch. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the floor, his mind racing. Jake wasn't just hard-working, he was selfless. For a moment, David felt small. Here he was, a man with money, comfort, and success, and yet this young man with nothing but compassion seemed richer in every way that mattered. He looked up finally. Laura, I want to do something for him. Something more than just paying for his medicine. Dr. Hayes tilted her head. Like what? I don't know yet, he said slowly, but something that actually changes his life. Something lasting, Laura smiled gently. Just make sure you don't take away his pride in the process. He's proud, that one. Never accepts handouts, David nodded. I noticed. There was a silence, the kind that feels heavy with unspoken understanding. Then David said quietly, You know what the irony is? Back when I was struggling, I promised myself that if I ever made it, I'd find a way to pay it forward. Maybe Jake is the reason I was meant to keep that promise. Dr. Hayes smiled warmly. Maybe so. That evening, David didn't go straight home. He parked his SUV near the town's old church and watched the snow fall through the windshield. Across the street, lights flickered inside the community shelter. Through the frosted glass, he could see volunteers serving food. And there he was, Jake, wearing a plain sweatshirt. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, handing out bowls of soup with that same quiet smile. Every few minutes, he'd stop to chat with an older man or pat a child on the head. There was no exhaustion on his face now, just calm purpose. David sat there for a long while, unable to look away. He thought about his own mother, long gone now, about how she used to tell him, when life blesses you, don't build higher walls. Build longer tables. And now, as he watched Jake serve meals to strangers, those words returned like a whisper. This was the kind of man who deserved a chance. Not pity, not charity, a chance. To live the kind of life he'd been denied by circumstance. Back at home that night, David stood in front of his fireplace, staring at the dancing flames. The grocery receipt still sat in his jacket pocket, Jake's handwriting marking the total. He took it out, ran a thumb across the ink, and made a decision. No more small gestures. No more anonymous kindness. If he truly wanted to honor the stranger who once saved his mother and repay the debt that had shaped his life, he would make sure Jake Miller and his mother never had to struggle again. He didn't know how yet, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about giving back the hope that had once saved him. The wind howled outside as David whispered to himself, his voice barely above a murmur. Your turn, Jake. Your turn to see what kindness can do. And with that, he picked up the phone, ready to make the first call that would set everything in motion. A new chapter of both their lives had just begun. The storm rolled in without warning that night, sheets of cold rain pelting the quiet streets of Maplewood. The hospital's fluorescent lights glowed against the dark sky, reflecting off puddles as ambulances came and went. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, metal, and worry. Jake Miller sat on a hard plastic chair outside the ICU, elbows on his knees, his face pale and drawn. His clothes were damp, his hair messy, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the small heart monitor through the glass window. The soft, rhythmic beeping was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Inside the room, Mrs. Miller lay motionless, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose. Her chest rose and fell weakly. Just 2 days ago, she'd been smiling, telling Jake stories from her childhood. And now she was barely conscious. Her heart had given out again. A nurse approached quietly. Mr. Miller? Jake looked up instantly. Yes? She hesitated, glancing at the clipboard in her hands. The doctor needs to see you about your mother's treatment. Could you come with me? Jake stood quickly, following her down the hallway. His boots squeaked against the clean linoleum floors, and every step felt heavier than the last. When they reached Dr. Sarah Collins' office, the same doctor who'd treated Mrs. Miller for months, Jake immediately saw the concern in her eyes. "Jake," she said softly, motioning for him to sit. "Your mom's heart condition has worsened. The medication isn't working anymore. She needs an emergency procedure. Tonight." Jake's breath caught. What kind of procedure?" "A cardiac catheterization," Dr. Collins explained. "It's minimally invasive, but it has to be done right away. Without it, her heart might not hold out through the night." Jake's hands gripped the edge of the chair. "Then do it, please. Whatever it takes," Dr. Collins sighed, glancing down at her chart. "Jake, the cost is around $12,000. He froze. "12,000? He almost laughed in disbelief. "I don't have that kind of money." "I know," she said gently. "We've tried applying for emergency financial aid, but it'll take time. Time we don't have." Jake rubbed his face, his mind spinning. "Can't I pay part now? I've got maybe a few hundred. I'll pay it off." "Jake," she interrupted softly, "the hospital can't start the procedure without a deposit. I wish it didn't work that way." He looked at her, panic welling in his chest. "So what happens if I can't pay right now?" Her silence said everything. Jake stood abruptly, shaking his head. No, there's got to be another way. I'll figure it out." He stormed out of the office, his heart pounding, and started making calls. Anyone. Everyone he could think of. First, his manager at the grocery store. "Mark." "It's Jake. I need an advance on my paycheck. My mom's—" "Jake, I'm sorry," Mark interrupted. "You know the policy. I can't approve that." He hung up and called the diner. "Linda, please, just a loan. I'll work double shifts for a month." "Jake," her voice softened. "I wish I could, honey, but the owner barely covers overtime as it is. He called friends, old co-workers, even the local church. Every answer was the same. I'm so sorry, I can't." By midnight, his voice was hoarse, his phone battery nearly dead. He walked out into the cold rain, sank onto the curb outside the hospital, and buried his face in his hands. His whole world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He whispered into the night, voice breaking, "Please, God, not her. Take anything, just not her." The sound of rain was his only answer. He sat there for what felt like hours, soaked to the bone, shivering, tears mixing with the rain. He didn't notice the figure approaching until a hand gently touched his shoulder. "Jake?" He looked up, startled. Standing in front of him was David Anderson, holding an umbrella. "Mr. Anderson, what are you—" Jake stopped mid-sentence. "Wait, how did you know I was here?" David gave a small, almost sad smile. "Dr. Collins called me." Jake frowned, confused. "You know her?" "We've worked together on charity cases before," David explained quietly. "She told me what's happening." Jake's eyes filled with shame and frustration. "You didn't have to come. I'll figure this out." David crouched down so their eyes met. The rain pattered softly around them. "You've been trying to figure everything out by yourself for too long." Jake looked away. "It's my mom. She's all I've got." David nodded slowly. "I know. I remember what that feels like. For a moment." They sat in silence, two men on opposite ends of life, yet somehow in the same place. Finally, David spoke again, his voice low but steady. "Sometimes," he said, "miracles wear human faces." Jake frowned slightly, not understanding. "What do you mean?" David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a hospital payment form. "It means you don't have to do this alone." Jake stared as David handed him the form, his mother's name printed across the top, marked, "Paid in full." He blinked, shaking his head. "What is this?" "The bill," David said softly. "It's taken care of." Jake's heart skipped. No, I can't let you." "It's already done," David interrupted. "The hospital's processing the payment right now. Your mom's going into surgery within the hour." Jake's hands trembled as he clutched the paper. "Why would you? How could you?" David smiled gently, eyes glistening under the streetlight. "Because once, someone did the same for me. A stranger helped save my mother's life when I couldn't. I never found out who they were, but I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd pay it forward." Jake's breath caught. "Wait, He froze, realization dawning. It was you. The pharmacy. You're the one who paid for her medicine. David nodded quietly. Yeah, that was me. For a moment, Jake could only stare at him, speechless. The man who'd been kind to him at the diner, who'd left big tips, who always smiled. It was him. Jake stood slowly, his voice breaking. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, David said softly. Just go be with your mom. Jake hesitated, tears streaming down his cheeks. I'll pay you back. I swear I'll... Jake, David said firmly, this isn't a debt. It's a gift. And one day, when you can, you'll pass it on to someone else. That's how this works. Jake swallowed hard, unable to speak. He simply nodded, overcome with emotion. David placed a hand on his shoulder. Go. She needs you. Jake didn't wait another second. He sprinted back inside, his heart pounding, clutching the paper like it was life itself. Dr. Collins met him at the door. Jake! The deposit just cleared. We're prepping your mother now. He looked back toward the doors, where David still stood under the rain, watching quietly. Jake lifted a trembling hand in thanks before disappearing down the hallway. David stayed there for a while, the rain soaking through his coat until the hospital lights flickered and the doors closed behind him. Then he whispered softly to himself, Hang in there, Mrs. Miller. Hours passed. Inside the hospital waiting room, Jake sat with his head in his hands again, this time not in despair, but in hope. The clock on the wall ticked endlessly. Every sound from the hallway made his chest tighten. Finally, at dawn, Dr. Collins emerged from the operating room. Her mask pulled down, exhaustion etched on her face, but she was smiling. Jake jumped to his feet. Doctor? She's stable, Dr. Collins said warmly. The procedure went perfectly. Your mother's going to be okay. Jake's knees almost gave out. He stumbled forward, tears filling his eyes again. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you so much, she smiled, touching his shoulder. Don't thank me. Thank your friend. He made it possible. Jake turned toward the hallway, but David was gone. Later that morning, when Mrs. Miller woke up, Jake sat beside her holding her hand. She blinked weakly, then smiled when she saw him. Hey, sweetheart, she whispered. You look like you've been through a storm. Jake laughed through his tears. You could say that. Did they fix it? She asked softly. Yeah, he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're going to be okay, Mom. You're really going to be okay. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. I told you, there are still good people in this world. Jake nodded slowly, his voice thick with emotion. Yeah, there really are. He thought of David, of his quiet generosity, his words in the rain, his belief that miracles could wear human faces. And for the first time in a long while, Jake truly believed it. Outside, as dawn broke over the small town, David Anderson walked alone down Main Street, hands in his pockets. The storm finally clearing, he stopped by a diner window, the same one where he'd first met Jake weeks ago, and watched as the morning light spilled across the empty booths. He smiled to himself, whispering, Your turn now, Jake. One day, you'll understand. The sun rose higher, golden light glinting off the wet pavement, and the town slowly came to life again. Somewhere inside the hospital, a young man held his mother's hand, and a stranger's kindness had just rewritten their future. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Maplewood, painting the small Ohio town in soft gold after the long night of rain. Inside the hospital, the air was heavy but hopeful, a quiet hum of nurses, beeping monitors, and footsteps echoing down sterile white halls. Jake Miller sat beside his mother's hospital bed, still holding her hand. She was sleeping peacefully now, her breathing steady, her cheeks warm again. The heart monitor beside her pulsed gently, a steady rhythm that sounded like life itself. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt the tightness in his chest ease. The storm outside and the one inside his heart had both calmed. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude. Thank you. Whoever you are. He didn't expect an answer, but he got one anyway, a soft knock at the door. When he turned, David Anderson stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. His hair was damp from the morning mist, his gray jacket slightly wrinkled, and his expression calm, almost fatherly. Jake immediately stood, emotion tightening his throat. "Mr. Anderson." David lifted a hand, smiling gently. "Coffee first." "Words later." He stepped inside, handed Jake a cup, and glanced at Mrs. Miller. "She's looking better," David said softly. Jake nodded, his voice breaking. "She's going to make it. The doctor said the procedure went perfectly." "That's good," David said, his tone full of quiet relief. "She's strong." "You both are." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, just honest. Jake stared into his coffee, the steam rising in lazy swirls, his thoughts heavy with questions he didn't know how to ask. Finally, he whispered, "Why me?" David looked up. "What do you mean?" Jake's eyes filled again. "Out of everyone. Why did you help me?" "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything." David leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "Because once I was you." Jake frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. David sighed and looked out the window, watching the morning light filter through the blinds. "I grew up in a small town just like this. My mom raised me alone after my dad left. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables by day. She used to say, 'Kindness is free, but it's the hardest thing to give when you have nothing.'" He smiled faintly, then his voice grew quieter. "When I was 21, she got sick. Heart failure. We didn't have insurance, barely had enough to eat. I begged for help. Banks, neighbors, even the church. But no one came through. I watched her die in a hospital bed because I couldn't pay for the treatment she needed." Jake's heart twisted. "David!" David's hands trembled slightly as he continued. "The night she died, I promised her something. I told her that if I ever had the means, I'd never let someone else go through what we did. That no one's mother would die just because they couldn't afford to live." He turned his gaze back to Jake, eyes glistening. "That's why I helped you." Jake sat there frozen, unable to breathe for a moment. His throat tightened until he couldn't hold it in anymore. He set the coffee down, stood, and without a word, pulled David into a hug. It wasn't just a thank you hug. It was everything he couldn't say: gratitude, grief, relief, and the deep connection of 2 souls who had both known pain too closely. David's breath hitched. He hesitated for a second, then hugged him back tightly. Both men stood there, silent tears falling. When they finally pulled apart, Jake wiped his face and said softly, "You didn't just save my mom's life, David. You saved mine." David smiled sadly. "No, Jake, you reminded me what it means to be human again." Jake frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" David sat down again, staring at the floor. "After my mom died, I threw myself into work. I built a company, made money, a lot of it. But somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started. I stopped feeling. Everything became about numbers and success and reputation. I told myself I was helping others by writing checks, but it wasn't real. It was distant, cold." He looked up, meeting Jake's eyes. "Then I saw you at that pharmacy. I saw your face when you realized you couldn't afford your mom's medicine. And I saw myself 20 years ago. It broke something inside me, but it also woke something up." Jake swallowed hard, listening, his heart pounding. "You reminded me that kindness isn't about grand gestures," David said softly. "It's about stepping in when it matters most, even if no one's watching." The door creaked open, and Dr. Sarah Collins stepped in with a clipboard. She smiled when she saw the 2 men. "Ah, my favorite patients, or rather my favorite heroes," she said warmly. Jake stood quickly. "Doctor, is she okay?" Dr. Collins nodded, her smile widening. "Better than okay. The procedure went smoothly and her vitals are strong. She'll be out of ICU in a day or 2. Jake exhaled deeply, his shoulders finally relaxing. "Thank God," David smiled. "That's the best news I've heard in a long time." Dr. Collins glanced between the 2 men. "You know, not every day I see strangers turn into brothers overnight." Jake and David exchanged a look, one that said she's not wrong. "Doctor," Jake said softly. "I don't know how to thank you both," Dr. Collins shook her head. Just keep believing in people, Jake. That's thanks enough. She gave Mrs. Miller a gentle check, then quietly left the room. Jake turned back to David. What happens now? David took a deep breath. Now? You go home when your mom's ready. Take care of her. Keep working. Keep being who you are. Jake tilted his head. And you? David smiled faintly. I'll be around. Let's just say I have some plans. Plans? He nodded. You ever heard of the Anderson Foundation? Jake's eyes widened. You mean the big charity that funds medical bills and college scholarships? David chuckled. That's me. Well, it's supposed to be me. Lately, it's been run by accountants and lawyers more than by heart. But that's about to change. Jake stared in awe. You're... That David Anderson? Last I checked, David said lightly, then added with a grin, though I prefer that guy from the pharmacy. Jake laughed, shaking his head. You could have told me who you were and ruined the story? David smiled. No, it's better this way. They sat for a long moment, both sipping what was now cold coffee. The silence between them was peaceful, full of meaning. Finally, Jake said quietly, If there's ever anything I can do for you, there will be. David interrupted gently. Just keep your promise. Jake blinked. What promise? The one you made last night, David said, his tone soft but firm. When you prayed, Jake froze. How did you? David smiled knowingly. Let's just say I've been where you are. I knew you'd pray. We all do when we're desperate enough. Jake nodded slowly, tears threatening again. Then I swear, I'll never forget this. And I'll pay it forward. Someday. David stood, placing a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. That's all I need to hear. He turned to leave, but Jake's voice stopped him. David. He looked back. Jake's voice cracked slightly. You said someone once helped you. Do you ever wish you could have thanked them? David paused, his eyes softening. Every day. But maybe helping you was my way of saying thank you to them. Then he smiled, gave a small nod, and walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind him. Jake sat there for a long time, staring after him. The morning light poured through the blinds, illuminating the small hospital room. His mother stirred slightly, whispering his name, and he turned back to her, smiling through tears. He realized then that the world wasn't as cold as he thought, that even in the darkest moments, there were still people who carried light inside them, people like David Anderson. That evening, Jake stepped outside the hospital for some fresh air. The rain had stopped completely now, replaced by the scent of wet earth and blooming lilacs from the hospital garden. The sky blushed pink with sunset. He spotted David near the parking lot, talking to Dr. Collins beside a sleek black car. Jake didn't approach this time. He just watched, a quiet understanding passing between them. As David got into his car and drove away, Jake whispered softly to himself, I'll make you proud. David, I promise. The days that followed Mrs. Miller's recovery were nothing short of miraculous. The hospital that once echoed with fear and heartbreak now felt alive with hope. Nurses often stopped by her room just to see the woman who had beaten the odds, and the son who never gave up. Jake Miller's life had changed in ways he couldn't fully explain. He still worked at the grocery store, still rode his old bicycle through the same streets of Maplewood, Ohio. But something inside him had shifted. The weight of despair had been replaced by purpose. Every morning, before heading to work, he'd make a quiet stop at the town chapel, not to ask for anything, but to give thanks for his mother's life, for the stranger who became a friend, and for the reminder that kindness still existed in a world that often forgot it. One crisp Friday evening, just as the orange glow of sunset stretched across the rooftops, Mrs. Miller stood in their small kitchen humming softly. Her movements were slower than before, but her eyes sparkled again. On the stove simmered her homemade chicken soup, her son's favorite, and a loaf of bread baked fresh in the oven filled the room with warmth. Jake walked in, carrying a bouquet of daisies. Mom, you shouldn't be up cooking. The doctor said you still need rest. Mrs. Miller turned, smiling. I'm resting between stirrings, sweetheart. Anyway, tonight is special, Jake grinned. Because you're home? She chuckled. That, and because we're having a guest. Jake paused, confused. A guest? Before he could ask more, there was a gentle knock at the door. Mrs. Miller's smile widened. That must be him. Jake frowned, walked over, and opened the door. Standing there, dressed in his usual gray jacket and carrying a small box of chocolates, was David Anderson. Evening, Jake, David said with a friendly grin. Your mom invited me, and I never say no to home cooking. For a second, Jake was too stunned to speak. Then he laughed softly. Of course. Come in, David. The warmth of the little house wrapped around them like a hug. It wasn't fancy. Mismatched chairs, a few old photos on the wall, a flickering lamp. But to David, it felt more like home than any mansion ever had. Mrs. Miller waved from the kitchen. Mr. Anderson, so glad you could make it. Please call me David, he said, setting down the chocolates. And I should be the one thanking you. This smells incredible. Dinner was simple. Soup, bread, and a small apple pie for dessert. But it was served with laughter and gratitude that no luxury restaurant could match. As they ate, they talked about everything, the weather, Mrs. Miller's recovery, the town's upcoming summer fair. Jake even managed to make David laugh with stories from the grocery store, like the time he accidentally knocked over an entire pyramid of cereal boxes. After dinner, Mrs. Miller insisted on making tea while the two men sat on the porch. The sky was a deep shade of purple now, the first stars appearing overhead. Jake leaned back in his chair, looking out at the quiet street. You know, David, I still don't know how to thank you. David smiled faintly. You already have. Jake shook his head. No, I mean it. You saved my mom's life. That's something I can never repay. David took a slow sip of his tea before answering. You don't owe me anything, Jake. What I did wasn't a favor. It was a promise. Jake frowned slightly. A promise? David nodded. A long time ago, I promised my mother that I'd never turn away from someone in need, no matter how small the gesture. I failed her once, but helping you, it felt like I finally kept my word. Jake looked down at his hands, feeling a lump rise in his throat. You're a good man, David, David chuckled. I try, but if you really want to repay me, Jake looked up eagerly. Anything. David leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. Then promise me something. Jake nodded slowly. Of course. When you can help someone someday. Do it, David said softly. Doesn't matter how big or small, just do it. That's how kindness keeps going. That's how people like your mother and mine get to live another day. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crickets sang in the distance, and the soft glow from the porch light bathed them in a golden hue. Jake's eyes shimmered. I promise. David smiled, the kind of smile that carried peace. Good. That's all I wanted to hear. Inside, Mrs. Miller peeked through the window, watching the two men. She smiled quietly, whispering to herself, God sends angels in all kinds of ways. The following week, Jake returned to work at the grocery store. Everything seemed the same. The hum of the refrigerators, the smell of coffee from the small cafe corner. But Jake felt different. He greeted customers with genuine warmth, carried groceries for the elderly, and even gave his lunch to a homeless man outside the store one afternoon. Each act, no matter how small, made his heart feel lighter. Word started spreading around town. That Miller boy's something special, but Jake didn't care about praise. He just remembered David's words. When you can help someone, do it. A few weeks later, Jake walked into the community center downtown. He carried a worn notebook filled with scribbled ideas. The center's manager, a cheerful woman named Linda Rogers, smiled when she saw him. Jake, what brings you here? I have an idea, Jake said, slightly nervous. An idea? Yeah, Jake said, placing the notebook on her desk. It's called the Miller Promise. Linda adjusted her glasses. The Miller Promise? Jake nodded. It's a small community fund. For families who can't afford medicine or emergency hospital bills. I know what that feels like, and I don't want anyone else to go through it. Linda blinked, surprised. Jake, that's incredible. How do you plan to start? Jake smiled humbly. With whatever I've got? I don't have much, but I can save a little from my paychecks, and maybe others will join in. Linda's eyes softened. I think they will. Weeks passed. A donation jar labeled the Miller Promise appeared at the grocery store counter. Customers dropped in coins, then dollars. Soon, local businesses joined in. The bakery, the pharmacy, even the diner where David and Jake had first met. It wasn't long before the fund was able to pay for its first case. A single mother who couldn't afford her daughter's asthma inhaler. Jake delivered it himself, tears in his eyes as the little girl hugged him tightly. Every time he helped someone, he felt closer to the stranger who once helped him, and to the mother who taught him to believe in goodness. One evening, Jake sat with his mother in their living room, sorting through envelopes. Look at this, Mom, he said excitedly. The Miller Promise just helped its 5th family this month. Mrs. Miller's eyes filled with pride. Your father would be so proud of you, Jake, and so am I. Jake smiled. You know who really deserves the credit? David. Mrs. Miller nodded gently. Yes, but you turned his kindness into something even bigger. Just then, there was another knock at the door. Jake opened it, and there was David again, standing with a warm smile and an envelope in hand. Evening, he said. Heard the Miller Promise is making waves around town? Jake laughed. You heard right. Come in. David stepped inside, handing Jake the envelope. This is from the Anderson Foundation. Consider it an investment in your promise. Jake opened it. Inside was a check for $50,000. He froze, speechless. David, I can't accept this. You're not accepting it for yourself, David said calmly. You're accepting it for the people who'll need it. Think of it as me keeping my promise. Again. Jake's eyes shimmered. David, I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep going, David said with a grin. Say you'll never stop helping people. Jake nodded firmly, tears threatening again. I will. I promise. That night, as David left, Mrs. Miller stood by the doorway, watching him disappear down the street. She turned to Jake, her voice soft. Jake, she said, when I was sick, I prayed for a miracle. Jake smiled. And we got one. Mrs. Miller nodded. Yes, but maybe we were someone else's miracle too. Jake looked out the window at the stars and whispered, I hope so, Mom, I really hope so. Months later, a small article appeared in the Maplewood Gazette. Local grocery clerk launches Miller Promise. Fund, helping dozens of families afford life-saving medicine. Beneath it was a photo of Jake and Mrs. Miller, both smiling, holding hands. Standing slightly off to the side, as always, was David Anderson. Smiling proudly, content to let others shine, he didn't need recognition. He'd already received his reward, knowing that his mother's legacy and his own lived on through the kindness he saw growing in the hearts of others. That evening, Jake visited the same pharmacy where the story had begun. He stood near the counter, watching a young man nervously count coins, short by a few dollars. Jake smiled gently, reached into his wallet, and slid a bill across the counter. Don't worry about it, he said softly. Someone once helped me too. The young man blinked, stunned. Why would you do that? Jake smiled. Because kindness always comes back. As he walked out into the cool night air, Jake felt the wind brush his face, the same wind that had once carried his tears. But tonight, it carried something else, hope. 1 year later, the little idea called the Miller Promise had grown beyond Jake's wildest dreams. What started as a donation jar at a grocery store had become a local foundation, saving lives, paying medical bills, and inspiring others to give. One afternoon, as Jake sat at his small office desk, sorting through letters of thanks, one envelope caught his eye. The handwriting was messy, a child's. He opened it gently and read aloud. Dear Mr. Miller, thank you for helping my mom when she was sick. She's better now because of you. Someday, I'll help someone too. Tyler, age 9. Jake smiled through tears. Holding the letter to his heart, David's voice echoed in his memory. When you can help someone someday, do it. That evening, Jake walked to the quiet cemetery at the edge of town. He placed a bouquet of daisies on his mother's grave and whispered softly, "Mom, your medicine saved more lives than just yours." The sky blazed with sunset, orange and gold streaks of hope. Jake stood there, stronger, grateful, and forever changed. One act of kindness can echo through a lifetime. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories every day.